Good morning.
Morning.
Isn't Jesus wonderful?
Yes.
So today is the 22nd of December. That's right. Only 2 more days till Christmas. You know what that means? Guys, we need to start shopping. Men always wait, right? Walmart still has plenty of stuff. There's Walgreens. Leave Speedway for the day of because they're open Christmas. So you can run out the last minute if you need to. Christmas is the number one holiday in the world, especially here in America. We've talked about this for the last few weeks. I've given you stats each week. Another one I found that was interesting was that between Generation Z, Millennials, Gen X, and Baby Boomers, who spends the most on Christmas? Any guesses? Actually, Millennials, believe it or not. Millennials spend $855 on average on the gifts on their list for 2022. Gen X is close behind them with 832, Boomers with 769, and lastly Gen Z with 559. Out of that money in all generations, it's spent pretty equally on clothing and accessories as we do on toys and hobbies at 77% each. Gift cards are a close second, 76%. Food and drink at 70%. Electronics, 57%, which I expected would be a little higher. Health and wellness at 56, pet supplies at 50, home and kitchen at 49. And I can see that it holds true. Don't buy your wife an appliance for Christmas. 49%, everybody knows. Nope, don't buy it. The majority is spent online. Second is department stores. Thirdly is discount stores. I don't blame them. I think I follow the same pattern. I'd rather buy you something on Amazon, given the choice. I know. Well, this week also means the last of my Christmas jokes. Everybody goes, yes. You're going to miss them. All right. The top 10 things to say about a Christmas gift you don't like. Number 10, hey, there's a gift. Number 9, well, well, well. Number 8, boy, if I had not recently shot up 4 sizes, this would have fit. Number 7, that's perfect for wearing in the basement. Number 6, boy, I hope this never catches fire. There are a lot of random unexplained fires this time of year. 5, if the dog buries this, I'm going to be furious. 4, I love it, but I fear the jealousy it will inspire in others. 3, sadly, tomorrow I enter the witness protection program, so I can't use it. Second, to think, I got this the year that I vowed to give all my gifts to charity. And number 1, I really don't deserve this. That's fine. Okay. So we've spent time gearing up for the breaking of the 7 seals in Revelation. And as such, seeing that the spiritual realm will respond to this. There's the arrival of the beast, the first and the second. We started looking at the Antichrist and some details about him. We see that Satan really doesn't like what's happening. He never really does, though. He's fought God at every turn, working to undo everything the Creator has put in motion. Paul tells us when speaking of the mystery of God, the church, in 1 Corinthians 2:8, which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Satan will work to stop any efforts he's aware of. But the whole situation and idea of salvation was so new and odd. And it really was quite a curveball for everyone in creation except God. We're at a bit of a hindrance when we grow up in the church, and this is just what we know. But you have to realize that for the longest time, this concept was as foreign as could be. We saw that Ruth taught us that the scroll being opened here in Revelation 6 is the title deed for creation. God had it. He handed it over to Adam, who was deemed worthy of the scroll at the beginning. This most likely angered Satan all the more than his pride already had. I think I can understand that idea. Not only was Satan not in charge of this new planet, even though he was still this angel, God had created this new creation, and he already had these angels praising him and proving their worth and value. This new creation was different and more like God than the angels were in some ways. They were also 10-dimensional, but they were unique in that we carried the image of God. Satan went down to prove humans couldn't be trusted by God. These humans sinned too. I mean, Satan wasn't perfectly behaved. We know that. He hadn't been in lots of trouble yet. I'll show you that later. But I could guess he was jealous of the attention that these new created beings were getting from the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And he sought to undo this by showing God humans were no better. Remember, he was cunning more than any other creation. And he observed humans. He knew their tendencies. And he could probably surmise their capabilities, both good and bad. He took advantage of Eve's lack of proper teaching and knowledge. And he appeared in his normal form, a being they would have seen many times, the Shining One. They had no reason to distrust him. They'd seen many of these creatures all the time. They came and go with the Lord when he was there in the evening, if nothing else. When Adam sees Eve in her sin, he knew what it meant for her. And he chose to follow her rather than live without her. When Adam does sin, he fails to meet the requirements of this title deed. Satan had attempted to trick them, hoping he would gain it, proving that maybe then, he could rule, which is what he was always after. Maybe hoping to show that God had overestimated this new creation. Satan wanted to rule anyway, with or without God's approval. The problem is that when he wants to claim this scroll, I imagine it floating away, closing itself, sealing. He couldn't claim it either. This made no sense. Adam had failed, so now surely he would be the worthy one. The title closes and the requirements written on the outside. As Satan sees them and sees what they contained, he saw he could never measure up to these rules. No one ever could. But what he also realizes is the status that man must have held to hold this in the first place. It would almost add salt to the wound, you can imagine. Not only is he not worthy, and no angel would be, but these men that God created are worthier than they are, somehow created better than angels. God had made them greater than angels. Good thing Satan tricked him into falling. On top of not giving this planet to the angels, especially him, because he thought of himself as the most worthy, as we know, they were better than angels could ever be. Satan was mad. No, not just mad. It was stronger than that. It was wrath. He was wrathful. He was enraged. He was hateful. He couldn't forgive this slight he imagined God had given him. Maybe he could use this with the other angels and turn them away too. But he thought he'd ruined God's plan. He made man lower than even he was now. This made him feel a little better, probably. I imagine until the Lord appears. He was so wrapped up in his thoughts, he'd missed how much time had passed. The humans had created clothing for themselves for some reason. Maybe it's because they're not shining like they were. God showed up as he always did, right in the cool of the evening. Why are they so special? The Father asked after him, and the man makes himself known and cowers before the Lord. And I can imagine Satan at this point thinking, that's pathetic. He would never cower. He would never bend a knee to God, unless he was forced to. The human shifts his blame to his wife. Well, technically, no, he shifted it to God, indirectly framing the wife as the result of God's decisions. And then the woman blames him. How dare she? But it mattered very little because God had had enough of the blame game. And he goes down the list and curses each of them, starting with Satan. If anyone was to be blamed, you can imagine Satan's thoughts always shifting. He's the perfect example of what we call a narcissist. Always shifting blame. Always being the victim. But for his sin, he was cursed to be lower than all of creation, to be so far beneath God's consideration that the lowest of this new creation was more important to him, to God, than him. Well, that flipped things. Satan hears that he will now prey on these humans and their offspring, but this woman's seed would be against him, dealing him a much deadlier blow than he could deal back. The father moves on to the other two. He curses all of creation, and man and women are now bound and lowered in status and dimension. Mankind would work, toil, sweat, and bleed. Good, this arrogant being thought. Satan was so wrapped up in his own little world and so demented by his own sin, he couldn't see past himself. Like I said, a total narcissist, spinning events where he was always the victim. He was always deserving of something better, entitled. He knew this human rebellion hurt the Father. All of creation, eventually, he thought to himself, would be mine. He would stand against the Father to prove himself worthy, not just for himself, but for the sake of all angels. This was an insult to them all, but mostly him. He would lead this new existence, one where he was worshipped, and the shackles of the Father's rule with the Son would be cast off. They'd be free of their old ways, similar to what we read in Psalms 2. Thousands of years go by, and he works to drive humans away. These humans are too easy to manipulate. They're too easy to sway. They seem to get easier than it was with Eve sometimes. Satan played the long game. He knew it would take many human lifetimes to achieve. He could wait. He wasn't mortal like they were. He was slowly learning more about this seed of the woman. It starts with Abraham. Slowly the plan is revealed. And as the details are revealed, his plan becomes more focused. It was all of humans, but then he learns it comes from Abraham, so he focuses on that line more. Then it comes from the town of Judah, or the tribe of Judah, so he can focus on the family. Line of David, you can focus on them. Try to take the whole family apart from the inside. Solomon will corrupt him so bad there's no heir. God makes sure there is one. Then born in the town of Bethlehem, he was getting closer, narrowing it down. Finally, he gets a focus on one family, this young girl who seems very important. He watches her, keeps tabs on her. She's very well protected. He would wait, see. Out of the blue, Gabriel shows up. What was God's favorite errand boy doing here? He was the messenger angel for the throne. He always shows up regarding the Messiah. He shows up to Daniel. He shows up before. So Satan knew what this was about. Good angels never veer from their assigned jobs. Gabriel tells Mary she would have a baby. The Lord would cause this without the normal function. Okay. And the baby would be named Emmanuel, God with us. What was the Father up to? Then, I imagine, Satan felt it. Every spiritual being felt it. A presence he would know anywhere. He had run into him many, many times in the throne room throughout heaven and on earth, speaking on God's behalf. A presence he'd hoped to avoid. A presence that, though Satan would never admit it, was greater by him than him, by infinity. A presence so overwhelming, so pure, so peaceful, so brilliantly glorious, all things that Satan worked to forget. It was the Son of God. Oh, duh. God with us. Gotcha. Satan thought, the plan's been staring me in the face the entire time. But this doesn't make any sense. Why him? Why here? Why now? What is this plan? Is this how God planned on saving these useless humans? Certainly the dumbest thing Satan had ever heard. You got to admit, he's not far off. It is a weird way to save the world. Think about it. This holiday season, this Christmas idea has caught on like wildfire for generations. The hope of all mankind, the Messiah, born as a helpless baby, the weakest of human forms. Why didn't he just come as a full human king? That's the end game, right? Just do it. It'd be easier to deal with. Satan has no problem killing humans. As long as God doesn't let the angels interfere, it's pretty easy. But this kid was someone so important, he could never get close. The watchful eyes of the angels and the Spirit was always on this Jesus. Satan wondered what the plan was. But remember, which none of the princes of this world knew, for had they known it, they would have never crucified the Lord. You know, we can look at the perspectives of a lot of people. Right now, at this point in the story, there's a lot of people to look at. You could look at Mary and speak of how her humble obedience in light of such amazing news made room for the Savior to be born. I mean, in that moment, when Gabriel's telling you that, if you imagine yourself there, I don't know what else there is to say, really, other than, okay, as the Lord wills it. I mean, what are you going to do? But she was obedient. How would that feel, ladies, mothers? You know what it's like to have your child growing, but to know that this child is not like any other child. This is the Savior of mankind growing, knowing his presence more intimately than many ever would. She'd always planned to have a child, of course, not like this. You could look at Joseph, a man who was called just in Matthew 1, or in the Greek, righteous, a keeper of holy laws, a follower of God's law, innocent, faultless, approved by God. A little more than just. A man who heard from Gabriel in his dream and followed the word of the Lord, apparently without any question. He had to believe, because otherwise no Jewish man would have kept her, thinking she cheated. And he had every right to put her away because he was promised a virgin. And by their laws, he wouldn't have to marry her. On top of that, you imagine he has to defend himself and her against family, friends, officials, co-workers. They all know. We know they know because in John 8, even the Pharisees pointed out. In the Greek, they know. Joseph is not your dad. Your mom cheated. That's what they talked to him about. You are the product of adultery. They have no problem throwing around this information. It must be known. But he held on to what he knew to be true, even until his death. We could talk about God and how he and the Son had agreed to this before the creation, before time began, and knew what would be required if man were created with free will. And how the Son agreed to these terms and agreed man must be created, even if it meant his own death. So the Father had to follow through in creating these creatures that would rebel, that would walk away, would mostly thumb their noses at him and his will, even actively work against him and his people, and would ultimately cost him his Son's life. Just to fulfill the requirements to restore a few of them. He would have to be separated from his Son by letting him become human and letting his Son give up a relationship and connection that existed then and he may never regain. watching him suffer, be mistreated, and die. He would resurrect him. But can any of you as parents, tell me that would make it easier? Still having to watch your child go through that? It would do little. You could look at the shepherds, you could look at Herod, you could look at the Magi, but in the end, his birth is a major milestone in history. No serious scholar, historian, secular, or religious doubts the historicity of his birth and existence, no matter what the Discovery Channel wants to say. The life of Jesus is one of the most documented lives in human history. We have multiple Roman, Greek, Jewish records of him. In fact, we have more copies and records of those 4 Gospels than we do of the writings of Shakespeare. We have more proof of his existence than most of the things you learned in history class. Honestly, though, do we care what secular historians say? Not if we care about what God says. And the idea of the Messiah has been around for a very, very long time. Ever since the fall of man in Genesis 3, we've had this idea known to man. It's widely agreed upon and understood. He was first promised in chapter 3:15. He was foretold that he would crush the head of the Nachash, and the Nachash would bruise his heel. The idea of the Messiah was passed down through the centuries as the patriarchs yearned for the arrival of their foretold Redeemer, the one who would arrive to save his people. He was not hidden in the Old Testament as it may seem. Adam and Eve knew about him. Job knew about him before the Jewish nation even existed. One of my favorite verses, Job 19:25. As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth. That's a bold statement. With a title that's usually Redeemer, that's usually used for the New Testament. In Genesis, Abraham was told about the blessing of the Messiah and how through his line, the blessing would be for the entire earth. We already know it's not just limited to the Hebrew children then. We see the hope. Got me? Weird. Well, we see the hope for a Redeemer in Egypt with the Jews. God tells David in 2 Samuel 7:12-13, when your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendants after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house in my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. What I want you to remember, what I want to close on here, is the reminder that on and on the Messiah was mentioned. He was prophesied. He was waited for. He was their hope. He was their future. He was their reason for fighting on and for continuing to survive. God was on their side. God had plans, but ultimately God was bringing his Messiah to earth through them for the whole world. He would be the answer they seek. He's the redemption they sought and the one true king. It's all true, and he did come. He arrived circa September 29th, 4 BC, just as he said he was on the first day of the Feast of Trumpets that year. But he arrived not to pomp and circumstance, but in a manger, out of the way, humble, practically unknown, and virtually unwelcomed by anyone. He arrived, he lived, he grew, and ultimately he changed the world more than anyone ever. It isn't because he was born that we have this, though. His birth is not our hope. It's not our reason, and it's not our answer. When times get hard and hurts pile on and the questions mount and we simply cannot see our way ahead, his birth is not why we can stand up and keep going. He came to earth as a human for one reason: to die for us all and to prove himself worthy. That is why we have hope. We have hope because he still is today our hope. We have answers because he is still today our answer. And we can find our way forward because he is still today our guide and our light. He's with us now, today, and will be here again, one day, ruling as he was prophesied to. Christmas is the time of year where we remember this, where we reflect not just on our friends and our family and the presents we get or the food we eat, but the gift of hope that was given to us 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem. In 3 days, we will be celebrating not just the birth of a baby in a manger, like some weird ritual we Christians value, but we will be celebrating why he was born and why we continue on. It is this why that gives us the hope we each have inside us, the hope we're supposed to explain to others. Do not let this opportunity slip us by. Let's be a witness as we celebrate this time. Let's stand and sing.